behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. As part of JLF Brave New World's ongoing series of Redux, we present Akbar, Ira Mukhoty in conversation with Manu S. Pillai. Akbar was the most admired of all Mughals and one of the only two Indian rulers to be widely known as the Great. But before Ira Mukhoty's writings, he has been without a modern biography. Here, Mukhoty talks about a groundbreaking study with fellow historian Manu S. Pillai. Ira Mukhoty is the author of Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens, and Begums of the Mughal Empire, and Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History, and the most recent, Akbar the Great Mughal. She writes rigorously researched narrative histories that are accessible to the lay reader. Manu Pillai is the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans and the Courtesans, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, and his other essays on history have appeared in Mint Lounge, The Hindu, Hindustan Times Open Magazine, New Statesman, and other publications. All our sessions that have been broadcast are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And in case you want to revisit any of them, and there's some brilliant sessions, you can just go and check them out. Please remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, Akbar, Ira Mukhoty in conversation with Manu S. Pillai.
Ira, since we only have about 30 minutes for this discussion, let's go straight to the questions without beating around the bush too much. There's been a lot of work that's been done on the Mughals in general. On Akbar specifically, people talk about his land revenue system, the way he changed his military, his religious aspects and policy. What was it that caused you or drove you into doing something as a biography? Because clearly nobody's done this in very many years, and you've gone ahead and done a biography on Akbar. Tell us why.
Yes, well, from my previous books, Manu, I have been somehow, dancing at the edge of Akbar, I think, in one way or the other. Right from Heroines, one of the women I looked at was Jahanara Begum, to understand the erasure of her, her amazing voice and her story. That brought me to the entire, the reign of the great Mughals, and that brought me on to my next book, Daughters of the Sun. And in that, I discovered so much that I had never known. I saw the full extent of these women's ambitions, the amount of talent they had, and how they were able to express this, how they were actually essentially very powerful women. And yet somehow over time and through our, the recording of the Europeans, the way in which they wrote about our Mughal history, these women had completely been erased from our narrative, and they had been presented to us instead as degraded women, as women essentially voiceless, essentially there for the sexual pleasure of the Pacha inside the cloistered space. And so when I realized that there was so much that we hadn't known about these women, I really started to wonder about how this process came about, apart from the fact that the Europeans interpreted it in this way. And there's no getting away from the fact that Akbar is very much in the middle of this process. In the beginning, we have Babur and Humayun, and with them, we have a certain type of Timurid women who are very adventurous. They are very visible. They travel along with their men. There's no question of keeping them in a sequestered space. They are visible. They're very lightly veiled. And they're very, very influential with their men, as mothers, as aunts, as sisters. And yet, around the time of Akbar, they disappear completely. Something happens to these women and they become completely immured behind the space, and their names are forgotten from history. They are described only as very chaste women by Abu al-Fazl, if he ever refers to them at all. Their names are altogether forgotten. So I realized, and yet at the same time, Akbar brought in many laws which showed that he was intensely aware of the suffering of women, which was an extraordinary thing for a 16th century Muslim monarch to do. He brought in, laws to do with sati, to do with polygamy. And so I was very interested in this dichotomy of Akbar. There was something there, that was puzzling to me. And I found that this dichotomy was not only there with regards to the women. For example, We know that he's considered an illiterate man, and yet his knowledge was so thorough that the Jesuits said if you didn't know that this man was illiterate, you would think him to be the most learned man in the empire. He was also intensely interested in philosophical discussions, and yet he was also he loved to watch theater performances, to watch jesters, to watch the most light of entertainments, and while he was he loved to hold these discussions in the ibadat khana. At the same time, he was intensely a physical man. He liked to watch his animal fights, the gladiators combats.
You have this very charming bit in the book where you talk about how I think it was the Jesuits who once saw him standing on a balcony or a terrace flying a kite with just a lungi around his waist.
That's right, just the lungi.
That's not the Akbar you think of usually. Yeah,
exactly. And thank God for the Jesuits telling us these tidbits. He was also, he had a terrible temper, and he could be quite pragmatic when he had to get rid of somebody. He killed his cousins, Kamran's sons, who were his cousins. At the same time, he was very sentimental about things, he could be moved to tears by a powerful ballad. So it was this dichotomy that interested me about Akbar. I wanted to present, if I was going to write a biography, I wanted to present to people the evolution of this great man. I didn't want to say, okay, here's this great man, this is why he is great. I wanted people to discover that for themselves, to go beyond a simplistic, infantilizing history that we tend to see people in black and white, good or bad. I wanted to move behind that, and that's what fascinated me.
It's interesting because if you look at Babur and Humayun, Akbar's immediate predecessors, his father and grandfather, Babur, of course, he found himself at one point almost completely alone in a forest. He had to really suffer and lose his homeland and then come off to India. Humayun came to India, his father raised an empire here, he lost it all. He had to suffer in his own way and then reclaim everything. Akbar also had that earthiness in one way, which was that all this was still very new, and therefore it was still very real, and it was still not completely concealed beyond protocol. But he's the one who starts creating that protocol. Now, behind all this, behind the Emperor Akbar, this man of protocol, this man on a throne, this man who is now seen almost as a semi-divine figure, there's also this, what is his personal character? How do you look at his personality as a man? As somebody who, you already alluded to his illiteracy, but from there, what is the man Akbar like?
The man Akbar is essentially, I think, really he was an enigma. Even to the people around him at that time. A Jesuit wrote about it very, very candidly, and he says, he's a man apparently free from mystery or guile, as honest and candid as can be imagined, but in reality so close and self-contained, with twists of words and deeds so divergent from one another, and most times so contradictory, that even by much seeking, one could not find the clue to his thoughts. And I think, essentially that is true about a man like Akbar, because there's so much which seems, contradictory, enigmatic. He had this experiential, I think he approached the world because he was fundamentally illiterate in the sense that he did not have that classical education. So he approached the world through a visceral knowledge of it, experientially, So, for example, when he had his animals, he got fascinated by the animals in Hindustan. He used to watch them endlessly, the cheetahs, the elephants, to understand their thinking. Like for elephants, he was amazed by their strength, and he wanted to know how to tame them. How can you bring a creature of such amazing power and strength to a place where they are obedient to you? And he used a psychology of sorts, really, with the cheetahs, the same thing. And if you remember, there's a scene where Abu al-Fazl, he seemed almost beside himself, but he's describing a situation where Akbar has leaned down to look at a web, a spider web, to see how a fly is trying to extricate itself. Yeah. So, I think Akbar had this attitude towards everything in his life, that he tried to viscerally own it, to live it, and to only, interpret the world through his own experience of it. That's why he was surrounded by the best counselors, by the best men. He took their advice constantly. But at the end of the day, he often made his own judgment, his own call on what he thought was right or wrong. And I think this came at the end of the day from trusting only himself.
And this is something that often confused the Jesuits as well as his courtiers, right? When you have the emperor of Hindustan on the floor looking at spiders, it's not a very kingly image. Equally with the Jesuits, you find that, they thought his interest in Christianity meant that he was going to convert. It was an imminent event. He was just going to give up Islam and become a Christian. And it took them a while to realize that no, he's just curious. He's not actually going to convert to Christianity. Now let's come to, speaking of the Jesuits, let's come to sources. Now you've created a biography of one of the most striking figures of, recent or the last 1,000 years in Indian history. And there's obviously the sort of Abul Fazl kind of writing, which is completely pro-Akbar. It's almost a eulogy to the emperor. Then there's, of course, the Jesuits who've come from outside, and they're viewing everything with their own filters. And finally, you've got someone writing a covert, secret, scathing account of his life as well. How did you play these sources against one another, and how did you figure out how to connect the dots when this thing is sort of sprawled all over the place?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, it's both a blessing and a curse. I've said it before, because unlike the women, like when I was researching the women, there was so little on them. I was sometimes desperate. For Akbar, there's almost too much when you look at how much Abu al-Fazl has written, tomes and tomes. So the question is, of course, as to see why they're writing, who they're writing for, who the intended audience is, and then pit them against each other. Each has a filter through which they're writing these histories. Naturally, even Badauni, we say it's a covert biography, which it is, but he wants to justify why he, as a very talented man, has never risen in rank as compared to Abul Fazl. So it's not a totally innocent account that he has as well. The Jesuits, very much so. They're trying to kind of, they have this ambition, which is to convert Akbar and to show everything else as lesser than Christianity. I mean, the language they used when I was reading the Jesuit accounts and Badauni's, I was like, who said history was boring? Look at this language, no political correctness at all, So exciting stuff.
And there's also these strange anecdotes, right? For example, Badauni talks about how at one point Akbar wanted to meet a Hindu saint or a sage of some kind, and he basically had this man sit on a cot, and the cot was sort of raised up to his window with sort of pulleys and ropes, and this man was hanging suspended outside.
Outside Fatehpur Sikri, this man was on a charpa, and they hoisted him outside the Akbar's balcony, and they had a lovely conversation in the middle of the night about the tenets of Hinduism. But the last thing I want to say about sources, and I'm going to show you a few images, is that one of the primary sources I did use, in addition to the Persian ones, the European ones, and the Jesuit ones, was miniature paintings. Because as you know, the Mughals, created this enormous corpus of miniature paintings. And sometimes they tell us a great deal more than what is written in the text. And we recently have wonderful work from the art historian that have brought out a number of exciting things to life. So I'm going to use this exciting technology and try and share a screen with you to show you a few images and give you some idea. Now, this first image, if you can see see that? Okay, so this is from the very first work that Akbar commissioned, and it's called the Hanzanama. So this was the story of the uncle of Prophet Muhammad, and he gets into all kinds of adventures and stories. And as you can see in this image, any self-respecting young man, there's a dragon involved, and Hamza is trying to kill the dragon. So this was the very first commission that Akbar made, and he ordered 1,400 images painted for the Hanzanama, the largest commission ever made. And this changed, the history of Mughal painting forever.
And this is what year, Ira?
This would be in the 1560s, early. Yeah, so very early on.
Very young man,
Yeah, exactly. So, this reflects. So when I read my text, I can see, yes, this is what Akbar is interested in. Look at the scale of his ambition, 1,400 paintings. Look at what he's doing. He's showing dragons and men fighting. So you get a very strong sense of the man and what his interests are. Now, if we go to another one, for example, which is quite different, much later on, for example, this one. Now, this is in the 1580s. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So here. Two images, right? So this occurs in the 1580s after Akbar has had all those discussions in the Ibadat Khana, and he's trying to understand the essence of different religions and how he can rule his kingdom peacefully in the best way possible. And he realizes that one of the big causes for people, getting into fights with each other is misunderstanding, just basic misunderstanding. And if he can remove that misunderstanding, it would cause people to understand each other better. And he didn't just leave it at words. He actually had the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Panchatantra, various other Hindu epics translated for the first time.
You can see Hanuman here with Ram and Lakshman, I think.
Lovely. and just look at them, look at that mix of, look at the kuchis, which are, so courtly, and at the same time, you see the, the Persian influence, the Hindustan, the Mughal influence. It's wonderful. So these are wonderful ways to actually substantiate what I'm saying and what I'm trying to show is by looking at the pictures. And the very last one I wanted to show is something quite different towards the end of his reign. Now, the earlier Hanzanama, if you remember, I was talking to you about, those were very big. Those were 1 meter tall, meant to be shown, in front of the storyteller. They were like a prop for a drama, and the listeners would look at the image and listen to the storyteller. Whereas this image that you're seeing, are you seeing I hope you're seeing what I want to show. Yeah. So this is towards the end of his reign. And this is a tiny piece of work. It's the work of Amir Khusro, one of the beloved poets. It's his Khamsa, and it has just 10 or 12 images. And in size, it is tiny, and it is much more contemplative, meditative. So you see Akbar changing from the earlier sort of, enthusiastic,
heroic.
Yes, and look at that. If I can just zoom in, because I'm very excited about this technology. Is it zoomed into this old lady?
Yes.
And okay, so who does the old woman remind you of? Manu?
The Virgin Mary, I think.
Yes, exactly. So by now, the Jesuits have come. They have brought all their images of, the Virgin Mary, who's a very important figure. She's important in Islam as well. So they use this figure, even though it's not a story about the Virgin Mary. It's about an old lady whose son has been accidentally killed by the Raja. And the Raja says, to atone for this, I can give you either a basket of gold, which is lying at his feet, or as you can see, he's ready to pull out his sword. He says, I can cut off my head to make up for it. Okay. So how I wanted to show how well the the Hindustani artists have used. Look at you can look at the modeling of her clothes. You can see the shadows. You can see the actual heaviness of her clothes, which doesn't exist in the right-hand side figure, which is much more typically Mughal. So it's interesting, and art historian Kavita Singh has pointed this out to say, look at with what confidence the artist.
Like the lady has a slightly more 3D effect than the gentleman.
Exactly, the gentleman who actually looks suspiciously like Akbar is much more flat, which is much more typical, in Mughal paintings.
Correct.
Whereas she's 3D, they've taken lessons from the European painting. So this again will sort of prop up what I am looking at through the Jesuit artists, that actually Akbar has no intention of converting, despite their great efforts, and what he is interested in, what all the Mughals, in fact later on also Salim and so on, is the European art. And they use all those symbols. They use the Virgin Mary, the cherubs, the halos, all of this in Mughal paintings.
Now, we've only got about 5-7 minutes, so I'm going to quickly ask you about Akbar the warrior and the empire builder, because as we've seen through the art, how he evolved from this sort of man who hero worshipped one kind of story to a man who contemplated the larger sort of questions of life and existence. Similarly, you find that this man was originally a conqueror. He could be fairly brutal even when necessary, but then it's over time that he starts shifting and realizing that he has to come up with something far greater than the here and now of politics and war. How do you sort of explain that transition?
Well, it's interesting, Manu, because very soon, early in his career, Akbar sort of uses war almost as a psychological means of convincing his opponents. As we were discussing how well he understood people, how he tried to understand their psychology. So even when he was conducting war, he was doing it in a way to sort of project himself as superhuman. So whether we talk about his Gujarat campaign, in which he marches, I think in 7 or 8 days, he covers, almost 1,000 kilometers in the middle of the summer heat. It is so startling by going at night on camels and all that. It is so startling to his opponent, who cannot believe that the Pasha of Hindustan has arrived at his doorstep without the royal elephants. Who's ever heard of such a thing? So you see, he challenges these old laws that have held for a long time, so that his opponent is shaken even before the battle begins. At another occasion, he goes to Patna, all the way across the country, using boats, and he takes gunpowder, he takes his cannons, he takes his elephants, his war horses, everything. This is something which Hindustani kings were not used to doing. They would wait for the end of the monsoon, for the nice cool weather, and then in a very gentlemanly fashion almost declare war on each other.
So he was a rule maker as much as a new rule maker.
Yes, exactly. He decided he was going to throw all that to the wind, and he used psychology. So the battle was almost won after the first few battles, which we know were very, definitely were very brutal and violent. After that, he used war in a sense psychologically to show people I am above the laws of regular war. I can do things that no man has done before.
Hmm.
And mostly people came around at that stage as well. And soon after that, there was no need for Akbar to really directly go to war. He would go on hunting expeditions, which were actually also
Yes, in
another
fact,
way.
that's one of the most fascinating things in the book, where every time he wanted to conquer some place or sort of chastise
Yes,
somebody, all he
yes,
had to do was go out on a hunt in the area, and people would just come back and say, "Okay, we surrender. We don't need to
exactly.
do."
Early on when I
Yeah,
read that, I was like, what is this hunting? Why are people so scared? But actually, it was thousands of soldiers
yeah.
involving weeks and weeks of, hunts where they would bring all these animals into a circle. And over a period of days and weeks, they would, slaughter these animals.
Yeah.
And it was a way of telling your opponent, you don't want to be in place of these animals, so best you submit.
Okay, one last question before we open up to the audience. The role of women. Now, this includes, of course, his Rajput women, because
Mhm.
we have Badauni sort of complaining about Rajput Hindu influence via the women in his harem. But it
Yeah,
also includes these Timurid princesses, his aunts and great aunts, who all have lots of influence
correct.
on him. So, how do you see Akbar as somebody who, clearly he was responsive to feedback from women?
Yes. He very much was, when you look at the way he changes, like initially he married a lot of women. Obviously he was conquering area. That was a good way to enter into relationships with other kings, but he very soon by 1577 was very worried about the number of wives he had and that they were illegal under Islamic law. So he brought in a qazi who was amenable to bringing in nikah law, so that
Hmm.
all these women could become legally wives of his. He was very worried about their condition. So you see many such instances. Like Sati, initially he was very admiring of the women, thinking that this is a great show of love. And
Yeah.
when he realized the coercion involved, he became very sensitive to that and tried to discourage men. So whether it was the Rajput women, through which, as you say, we see so much of the direct influence, whether it is in the, in his clothes, in his food, in his, being aware of their religious customs, to the Timurid ladies, he could
Hmm.
never make a decision. See, because the Timurid ladies were Orthodox Islamic
Yeah.
ladies. So whenever he had to take a decision against the ulema, for example, who usually had the blessings of these ladies, he had to be very careful to make sure
Hmm.
that they were preferably out of the country altogether, so that he could quickly
Yeah.
do, whatever he needed to
And
do.
you talk about how he would prevent news. He would take a decision in a
Yes.
way that the news didn't reach the women
When read
in
the
advance
and
of
Abu
what was
al-Fazl
reading.
himself writes it and
And
says,
then the other thing, of course, is where the Jesuits were, they came and told him that under Christianity, he'd only be allowed one wife, and he was
yes,
completely scandalized by the suggestion that
there
all his
was
other wives were no longer legal. Okay, we'll go
exactly.
to audience questions now.
Okay.
One interesting question is, what did Akbar from Ramkrishna Sachdev, what did Akbar really admire in Birbal? And, there's a lot of myth around Birbal, but can you
Yes.
explain the historical Birbal to us?
Yes. So there was definitely a man who was known later on as Birbal. He was this, Hindu Brahmin. And what we know about him, he joined early in service. He never rose very high, so I don't think he was a very great warrior. But he managed to be one of three men who was never chastised by the emperor.
Yeah.
Now, the emperor would chastise his men very regularly. If you ever stepped any line whatsoever, you were told off in no uncertain terms, sent back to
Mhm.
your jagir, refused admittance to the darbar. But there were three men: Tansen, Abu al-Faiz, Faizi, Abu
Yeah.
al-Fazl's brother, and Birbal. So these three men were never told off by Akbar, and Akbar kept Birbal very close to him. And I think what he loved about Birbal, because it is, I think, absolutely clear that he loved him, is his ready wit, his lightness of spirit, his repartee. This was
Mhm.
something which was very appreciated at the Mughal court, and his ability to just put a light spin on everything. Akbar
Yeah.
had his melancholic side, I think, which sometimes weighed him down. And when Birbal died, I think that was one of the reasons that Akbar never returned to Fatehpur Sikri. He could
Mm.
not bear the sight of Fatehpur Sikri without
Without
Birbal,
his friend.
and he mourned him for years. Um, and Abu al-Fazl says that he mourned him more than for any other Amir in the land. So yes, I think it was this lightness of touch, his, the way he was able to distract Akbar by his wit, and he was a singer, he was a poet. These were the talents that Birbal had, always by, and he was the only Hindu to accept the so-called religion of Akbar, the so-called Deen-e-Ilahi, which is not exactly that, but the cult that Akbar had. He was the only Hindu willing to stake his soul and say, okay, I'll follow you to the end.
Okay, next question is on, do you think the whole episode of Chittor is a blot on Akbar's legacy? And of course, I'm combining this with another question about history getting political because of episodes like this, especially if it's, a Muslim king. There is obviously, when there is this kind of violence against clearly one community at a certain point, how do you address that? Is it a blot and the politicization of that?
Well, it's so complicated, Manu, because these things were never like that. They were never Hindu versus Muslim, as you know. Now, Akbar had in his own battalions many Rajput men. He had Bharmal, Bhagwan Das, Man Singh, all these men who were fighting Chittor. The Chittor contingent had a sniper called Ismail with all his followers. So it was never. The past is not in black and white. It is not so simple. People did not see themselves only in terms of religion. There was so much more to them. There were communities, there were linguistic links, there were cultural links, culinary links,
ethnicity,
ethnicity, geographical, regional, clans. It was not Muslim versus Hindu the way we are seeing it now, where it has become politicized. To come to Chittor, what was shocking about Chittor when we look at it from today's point of view is, yes, it took 4 months for this campaign to end, for the siege to be breached, for the walls to be breached. And what is shocking really is not the death of the soldiers. That's what happens in war. Is that the civilian population who had also resisted were put to the sword as well. 30,000, it is said.
Yeah.
Now we find it difficult to understand. There are many reasons. I've talked about it at length in the book, but the fact is that we are looking at 16th century happenings with 21st century eyes, with the laws of battles, with Geneva Conventions. These things did not exist in those days. And Akbar knew that if he did not terminate this one campaign successfully, Rajasthan would never be his. And as a king, in the 16th century, what did you do? You conquered land. It was economic and strategic. And if you didn't, then your neighbor would rise up against him. That is definitely what he believed. So, we cannot judge these things from our points of view. That's why I have tried so hard to recreate the past, and try and make people feel that they are living these events with those eyes and, judging things differently, if at all. It's rather a question of understanding than judging.
In fact, that reminds me, even with his grandfather Babur, there was this one moment when he used jihadist language, is when he's finally cornered with Rana Sanga, and he really has to win this battle, otherwise it's make or break for him. And this seems similar for Akbar. This is that one moment in his career where he has to fall back on that kind of religious orthodoxy.
Exactly.
Okay, next question is, there is, of course, the question of Harkabai. Do you want to take that? The so-called Jodhabai, so-called Harkabai, nobody's even sure.
Nobody's clear about
such a thing ever happened. A Hindu princess marrying him.
Well, so the first Rajput wife he had was Harkabai of Amer, and she integrated the harem. She was allowed to keep her religion. She brought her entire retinue, entourage with her. She brought her nephew Man Singh with her brother Bhagwan Das. So there was an entire, cosmos of Rajasthani culture that came into the harem. And what
it's so visual to actually think of that.
Yes,
Rajasthani culture actually, such a colorful, visibly different culture. Yeah.
With the clothes, the language and everything. So what I think this is something which has fascinated people and Bollywood as well. But the fact is that she was Harkabai of Kachwaha, so she was certainly not Jodhabai. Now Jodhabai, Salim, later Jahangir, is the son of Akbar, is somebody who marries a princess of Jodhpur, so she could be called Jodhabai.
Yeah, it would be unusual for a Jaipur Amer woman to be called Jodha.
It would not happen. You were called by your father's clan. She would never have been called Jodha. So I think they just conflated the two, thought it sounded very nice, and made it Jodha Akbar. But what is fascinating to people and to Bollywood is this interaction of culture, and how this happened, how it came into the harem.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is actually quite, it's funny in a way, which is, how do you think Akbar would address a pandemic?
Okay, well, I know how to answer that actually, because somebody already asked me that question.
Oh, really?
Yes. So of course, there were no pandemics in those times, but there were epidemics and there was plague. So there's an interesting record of three different plagues that are written about at that time. So the first one is during the battle with Hemu, Vikramaditya, the very first battle, for Delhi. And Badauni had written that there was a terrible plague. And, though the common people and the people in the cities had no food, no grain, no water, yet the elephants of both Hemu and the Mughals were fed on oil and rice and wonderful. So you can see at that time how there's a clear demarcation for the king and the king's animals and all the soldiers. So that is one instant. Later on in Gujarat, a terrible famine occurs when Akbar conducts many campaigns. This causes devastation. So what does he do? He calls in Todermal to review the entire system, to look at revenue collection again, and he spends 5 years doing that and revitalizing the economy. So that is a different way of reacting to an epidemic. The last one is in Kashmir, I think in 1597, when there's an epidemic due to drought, I think. And this time, Akbar does a great deal more. He opens 12 soup kitchens, places to distribute food freely every day to people. Thousands of people were fed. He does away with 55 difficult taxes, which are making life difficult for people, including the cleaning of saffron flowers for free. And he starts building works on a huge stone wall on Hari Parbat outside Srinagar, and employs Mazdoors and pays them. And he writes on the wall that every single Mazdoor was paid for their labor so that they could survive the drought. So you see, he's taking active from the beginning, where he couldn't do anything when he was a young man, to the end of his life, where he takes active measures to help people out in difficult times.
So final question, since we're running out of time, we've got exactly 2 minutes before we close, and sorry we can't take any more. But the final question is, in the course of your research, did you find anything about Akbar that really came as a surprise? Like, what was the one big surprise that struck you when you were doing this book? Is there something that you sat up and you thought, gosh, this is something I'd never heard of, this is something I'd never thought of? What is that one, moment really?
I guess, there were so many, Manu, because I had just, like many of us, I had this cardboard cutout image of Akbar, Akbar the Great, Akbar, this man who has achieved so much, unified the empire, brought in a new religion, I thought. So I guess...
It wasn't a new religion, right?
Yeah, that's what we were told. So, I think what surprised me was how much myth-making, again, I shouldn't have been surprised because there was for the women, how much myth-making there was around Akbar, and how his journey was a progressive one, I suppose, which is why I tried to bring that out in my book as well, to show the smaller things that make him human. This was a man who was very human at the end of the day.
And yet deserves the title of Akbar the Great.
Sure, absolutely.
Cool. So that's a good note to end on. Sanjoy, back to you.
Thank you, Ira Mukhoty, and thank you, Manu S. Pillai, for that fabulous session. And those of you who have not had the opportunity to read the book, go right out there and pick it up. I did, and let me tell you, it's such a fabulous read. It really busts all the myths that you ever read about Akbar, and it's beautifully written, beautifully researched, and it's really one of the most engrossing books that I've read, certainly on my top 10 for this year. So thank you for that conversation, and thank you all for watching. Promise you won't regret reading Akbar by Ira Mukhoty. I do hope you all will log in next Wednesday and Friday to view more episodes in part of our special season of Redux. Coming up is Margaret Atwood, The Science of Storytelling. Margaret Atwood, in conversation with Megha Majumdar, one of the greatest writers of our times. Margaret Atwood speaks of the power of language, the science of storytelling, and the challenges of the present. This will be at 7 p.m. IST, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Our second session on Wednesday, the 19th of August, will be Ottolenghi's Lockdown Kitchen. Even while food has become one of the biggest levelers across the world during lockdown, you'll be able to listen to Yotam Ottolenghi in conversation with Ravinder Bhogal with his favorite restaurants and his best-selling Ottolenghi cookbooks. Yotam Ottolenghi has established himself as one of the most exciting talents in the world of cookery and food writing. Ottolenghi's food inspiration comes from his strong Mediterranean background and his unapologetic love of ingredients. Not a vegetarian himself, his approach to vegetable dishes is wholly original and innovative based on strong flavors and stunning fresh combinations. Here he talks to award-winning food writer and chef Ravinder Bhogal about his life and work and what we should be cooking. This will be at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. See you soon.